How did people survive in the Middle Ages, when winter was not just a season, but a ruthless predator that took the weak? We imagine their existence as an endless struggle against cold and hunger in windblown huts. But what if behind this picture of despair is a story of incredible ingenuity, a story of how our ancestors, having nothing, used everything, turning poison into food and garbage into salvation? This story takes you into the chilling world of a medieval English village, where survival was a high art and knowledge of nature was the ultimate treasure. It is the story of how people, pushed to the limit, made small but ingenious discoveries that allowed them to survive until spring. Why was beer safer than water? How did they learn to eat tree bark and poisonous acorns? And how could ordinary dung be a cure for a deadly wound? Today we're going to reveal 10 shocking and unexpected ways that helped medieval Englishmen cheat death in the freezing winter. Are you ready to learn that survival in the past was not so much suffering as a triumph of the human mind over the elements? Then let's begin. The first and foremost threat in winter, besides cold, was thirst and waterborne diseases. Rivers and streams could freeze, and water in shallow wells often became stagnant, polluted with sewage, and a breeding ground for deadly diseases. A modern person would have solved this problem by boiling water, but for a peasant who saved every chip, it was an unthinkable luxury to constantly boil water for the whole family. And they found an ingenious, albeit unexpected for us, solution. They hardly drank water in winter. They drank beer. It is not the strong, hoppy drink we know today, but the so-called small beer, or more precisely, ale, since hops became widespread in England later. It was a weak, cloudy, thick drink with an alcohol content of no more than 1.5%, which was brewed in almost every home. The brewing process was key to survival, and it was predominantly women's work. The female brewer, the brewster, was the central figure in the household. The water for ale was heated in a large cauldron over the hearth, which had already killed much of the bacteria. Barley malt, a sprouted and dried grain, was then poured into the hot water. The hot water activated enzymes in the malt, which broke down the starch into sugars. The resulting sweet wort was strained and left to ferment, adding yeast from the previous batch. Most importantly, the fermentation process. Yeast, which greedily consumed sugars, created alcohol and carbon dioxide, and formed an acidic environment in which most pathogens that cause dysentery, cholera, and typhoid simply could not survive. Thus, small beer was not only a source of calories and valuable B vitamins from yeast, but also, in fact, a sanitized, safe-to-drink liquid. It was drunk by everyone from gray-haired old men to small children who were given it diluted. A child drinking such ale got calories, vitamins, and a safe liquid, whereas a glass of well water could kill him in a week. In winter, when rations were scarce and energy was needed to keep the body warm, the caloric value of beer was invaluable. It was not a drink, but food, liquid bread. It warmed, quenched thirst, and provided the body with easily digestible energy. It was not drinking, but a survival strategy. A peasant going to work in a frosty forest took with him not a flask of water, which could freeze, but a leather burdyuk or a wooden barrel of ale, which remained liquid at lower temperatures and gave strength. Beer production was a continuous cycle. The waste from brewing, pellets, went to feed the cattle, which provided manure for the fields where the barley grew for the new beer. This simple but ingenious biotechnology was able to turn dangerous water into a safe, nutritious, and warming product that helped to survive the darkest months of the year. When in the middle of winter, in the hungry months of January and February, the peasant household's grain and dried vegetables were running low, the real famine began. At that moment, the peasant turned to his last source of food, the forest. But he was not looking for berries or mushrooms, which were not available in winter. He resorted to real forest alchemy, turning what we consider inedible or even poisonous into life-saving food that can sustain life until spring. The main such resource was acorns. Oak forests covered much of England, and in harvest years the ground beneath the oaks was littered with acorns. However, raw acorns are inedible and toxic to humans due to their high content of tannins. Tannins? Tannins give them an unbearably bitter, astringent flavor and in large quantities can cause serious kidney and liver damage. To make them edible, farmers developed and passed down from generation to generation an elaborate leaching process. In the fall, women and children would gather acorns, dry them, and then grind them into coarse flour with a simple stone millstone. Then began the longest stage, washing. A bag of acorn flour was simply dropped into a running stream for a few days. The icy water slowly but surely washed away the bitter tannins. Another faster method was to boil the flour in several changes of water over a hearth, each time draining the dark, bitter broth until the water was clear. After this treatment, the bitter flour became unleavened and edible. It was dried by the hearth and used to bake flat, heavy black cakes on hot stones. They were tasteless, dense, and tough, but caloric and nutritious, rich in carbohydrates, fat, and protein. These acorn loaves were often the only food standing between a family and starvation. Another source of food was the bark of trees. Peasants knew that it was not the rough outer bark itself that was edible, but the thin, living inner layer between the bark and the wood, the cambium. It is through this layer that the tree's juices flow. It was carefully scraped off pine, birch, or elm trees, taking care not to damage the tree itself too much. This layer was dried and then ground into flour. This flour was added in small quantities to the meager supplies of rye or barley to stretch them. Bread with the addition of such flour was bitter and coarse, but it filled the stomach. In the most desperate times, people ate dried and crushed tree buds, roots of wild plants such as burdock, and even some mosses and lichens that had been boiled for a long time. This was not cooking, but survival chemistry, the secret knowledge of how to neutralize poisons and extract calories from the heart of the winter forest. In a peasant hut without a chimney, smoke was both a curse and a blessing. It ate the eyes, caused painful coughs, and covered everything with black soot, but it also carried precious warmth that could not be let out. To find a balance between the ability to breathe and the need to warm themselves, peasants intuitively developed the high art of fire management, using different types of firewood. And one of the most unexpected and counterintuitive techniques is the widespread use of raw or green firewood. It would seem to be quite illogical. Raw wood full of moisture burns very badly, smokes heavily, and gives little visible heat. But that was their secret. When the main heat in the hearth was already created with the help of dry, well-burned wood, one or two massive logs of freshly cut green wood, such as ash, alder, or maple, were placed on the hot coals. Such a log did not burst into a bright, cheerful flame. It began to slowly smolder and dry right in the hearth, emitting huge amounts of thick, dense, white smoke that was actually a mixture of steam and products of incomplete combustion. This smoke was not as hot and acrid as that from dry wood. It was heavier and contained a lot of water vapor. It did not rush straight up to the smoke hole in the roof, but spread slowly through the hut, creating a dense, warm cushion under the ceiling. This smoke screen significantly slowed down convection, air circulation in which warm air rises quickly and escapes, and cold air is sucked in through gaps to take its place. The thick, moist smoke from the green fire literally sealed the heat inside the room. Often a special technique was used. A large, thick, raw log, the back log, was placed at the back of the hearth. It could smolder for almost a day, serving as a reflector and a slow source of heat, while smaller dry logs burned in front of it. The very process of smoldering a raw log was very long. It could smolder for hours, keeping the heat level minimal and the smoke billowing without the need to keep adding wood. It was an ideal strategy for long winter evenings when the family gathered around the hearth for small chores. Dry wood was used for quick heating and cooking, and green fire was used for slow, economical heat. Different types of wood produced different smoke. Alder smoke was considered mild, while coniferous smoke was more resinous and acrid. The peasant, like an experienced conductor, controlled his fire, changing scores of dry and damp wood to achieve the desired effect. Heat without carbon monoxide, and energy conservation without the risk of freezing. For modern man, constant smoke inside the house is a sign of malfunction and mortal danger. For the medieval peasant, smoke from a hearth without a chimney was an integral, albeit unpleasant part of everyday life. But it had another, quite unexpected and vital function. It served as a powerful preservative for the house itself, turning it into a kind of giant smokehouse and protecting it from decay, vermin, and destruction. The roof of a peasant hut was most often covered with a thick layer of thatch or reeds, up to half a meter or more. When dry, it is an excellent insulating material, but in England's perpetually damp climate, it was extremely vulnerable to rot, mold, and mildew, which could destroy a roof in a few seasons. In addition, warm and dry thatch was also a favorite place for pests, mice, and birds, which also compromised its integrity and insulating properties. The constant presence of smoke in the underbed space solved all these problems. The smoke rising from the hearth slowly seeped through the thatch before finding its way out. The chemicals in the wood smoke, creosote, phenols, aldehydes, settled on the straws, soaking them through. This process, chemically similar to smoking fish or meat, made straw unpalatable and poisonous to bacteria, fungi, and insects. It killed mold spores, repelled wood-boring beetles, and even mice, which could not stand the acrid odor. The roof, which in normal conditions would have rotted in 5 to 7 years in such a smoked state, could serve for 20, 30 years and more, requiring only minor repairs. The same thing happened to the supporting wooden frame of the house. The massive oak beams, constantly smoked by the smoke, were covered with a black, resinous coating and became almost invulnerable to woodworms. The smoke created a thin protective layer on their surface that repelled the pests. In this way, the house preserved itself from the inside out, becoming more durable. The whole interior of the hut was black with soot, but this blackness was the price of durability. Moreover, smoke was also used for the purposeful processing of food. Pork hams, strips of bacon, sausages, or gutted fish were often suspended from the ceiling on special poles or hooks. They were slowly smoked in the smoke from the hearth, acquiring not only a distinctive flavor, but also the ability to be stored for a long time without spoiling. The entire shack functioned as one large multifunctional smokehouse, where both food and the dwelling itself were simultaneously preserved. This striking symbiosis, where the byproduct of heating became a key element in preserving the house and food supply, was the height of pragmatism and unconscious genius. Winter nights in the Middle Ages were long and almost completely dark. Beeswax candles were incredibly expensive and only available to the church and the upper nobility for liturgical purposes. Tallow candles made from animal fat, beef or lamb, were cheaper, but were still a value that the common peasant could not afford to burn every night. The main source of light was the fire in the hearth, but its flame was often insufficient for any delicate work. So peasants turned to surprising, unexpected, and sometimes foul-smelling sources of light. One of the most amazing was the so-called candlefish. In some regions, especially closer to the coast, there were species of small marine fish so fat that they could be used as a primitive lamp. The most famous example is smelt, eulachon, but other species such as capelin or herring could also be suitable. The caught fish was carefully dried until it became hard. Then a wick of vegetable fiber, e.g. reed heartwood, was carefully passed through it, or the tail was simply set on fire. The fish, soaked in its own fat, began to smolder slowly like a candle, giving off a dim, heavily smoked but quite tolerable light for quite some time. The smell, of course, was peculiar, a mixture of burning fat and fish, but in the general atmosphere of the hut, it was not the worst. More common were the grease lamps, or rafts. These were the simplest of lamps, a small bowl of rough clay, a hollowed-out soft stone, or even an oyster shell. Any available animal or fish oil was poured into this container. A wick made of a bundle of moss, hemp, or just a twisted strip of cloth was dipped into the fat. Such a lamp gave a weak, flickering flame, but it was enough for a woman to spin or mend clothes on long winter evenings, sitting close to the fire. The most accessible fuel for light was the so-called rushlights. Making them was an important autumn job for women and children. They gathered tall reeds from the marshes, carefully peeled off their green skin, leaving only a thin strip for support to expose the porous core. Then these long billets were repeatedly dipped in melted animal fat, which was absorbed into the core. Such a beam, fixed in a simple holder, burned brightly but very quickly, only 15-20 minutes, emitting a strong odor of burning fat. But a bundle of them could be prepared for the evening. Light was not just a convenience, it was an instrument of productivity, allowing productive life to continue even after sunset. In winter, feet were one of the most vulnerable parts of the body. Constant contact with frozen, wet ground threatened frostbite, and the simple leather shoes of that time, sewn from 1 or 2 pieces and lacking thick soles, provided poor protection from cold and moisture. If a peasant's feet got wet or frostbitten, he risked not just his health, but his very life. Illness meant inability to work, which meant hunger. And here another priceless gift of the forest came to the rescue, which today we hardly notice under our feet: moss. Peasants used moss, particularly sphagnum, also known as peat moss or bog moss, as an ingenious multi-purpose material for insulating shoes. Gathering moss was an important fall harvest that women and children did. They knew where to find the thickest and cleanest cushions of sphagnum in bogs and damp forests. The collected moss was carefully dried by the hearth or in the smoked rafters of the hut, turning it into a light, springy material. Before leaving home, they stuffed their shoes or boots with this dry moss, creating a thick, resilient insole that worked in several directions. First, moss, like straw, is extremely porous and retains air perfectly, which made it an excellent insulator. It created an elastic barrier between the cold, frozen ground and the foot, preventing the body from losing precious heat. Secondly, sphagnum has phenomenal hygroscopic properties. It can absorb 20 times more moisture than it weighs. If a shoe got wet from snow or puddles, the moss would absorb the water like a sponge, leaving the foot relatively dry. This was critical for preventing frostbite, as wet skin freezes many times faster than dry skin. But the most amazing property of sphagnum is its strong antiseptic and antibacterial qualities. Its cells contain phenolic compounds and polysaccharides that inhibit the growth of bacteria and fungi. For centuries, moss has been used to dress wounds to prevent infection. Archaeologists find evidence of this throughout Northern Europe. In shoes, it performed the same function. It prevented the development of fungus, bacterial infections, and unpleasant odor, which were inevitable when constantly wearing wet shoes. A foot wrapped in moss was not only warm and dry, but also in a kind of sterile environment. This technique was so effective that it was used by warriors, hunters, and travelers for centuries. In some northern regions, moss was even used to make socks or shoe liners. This was another secret knowledge that allowed people to remain mobile and efficient in the harshest conditions. Winter was a time of illness and injury. Colds, frostbite, and festering wounds from careless handling of an axe or knife were commonplace. In the absence of antibiotics, antiseptics, and professional doctors, peasants relied on folk medicine, a mixture of centuries of experience, superstition, and desperate necessity. Some of these methods may seem shocking and dangerous from our point of view, but they were the only available alternative to inaction. One of the most striking remedies was fresh cow or horse manure. It was used as a warming compress or poultice known as cataplasma. Warm, moist dung applied to an abscess, boil or joint inflamed from rheumatism was believed to draw out the disease and pus. From the point of view of modern medicine, this seems crazy because of the risk of tetanus and blood poisoning. But there was a crude pragmatic sense to it. A warm, wet compress actually improved blood circulation in the affected area, which could speed up the maturation of the abscess and its bursting outward. In a world where there were no other ways to open a pustule, it was a desperate but sometimes workable method. Another amazing and much safer remedy was the spider's web. Clean, thick cobwebs from the corners of a barn or hut were carefully collected and used to stop bleeding from small cuts and wounds. It was applied directly to the wound. Today, we know that this practice has a scientific basis. Spider webs are rich in vitamin K, which promotes blood clotting. In addition, its fine but strong threads intertwine to create a mechanical mesh that helps platelets form a blood clot, working as a natural band-aid. Spider webs were also believed to have antiseptic properties, which may be due to the presence of certain protein compounds on them. Herbal decoctions were widely used to treat coughs, the main scourge of winter, but also stranger remedies. For example, syrup made from boiled turnips with honey, if there was any, or molasses. It was believed to soothe the throat and calm coughs. Frostbite was treated with goose or badger fat, which was rubbed on the affected skin to create a protective layer and soften it. Urine could be used as an antiseptic for washing wounds, which in its fresh form is practically sterile and contains ammonia. These methods were a mixture of real experience and desperate necessity. In a world where there were no other options, the peasant used whatever was at hand, from cobwebs on the wall to dung underfoot. It was survival medicine, where risk was justified by the hope of healing. When we think of medieval hunting, we imagine noble lords in brightly colored robes stalking noble deer and wild boar in their forests. But for the peasant, big game was completely inaccessible. Hunting in the lord's forests was poaching and punished severely, up to and including blindness or death. In winter, however, when the supply of salted meat and fish was exhausted and the body was desperate for protein and fat to generate heat, another hunt began. A quiet, inconspicuous, and desperate hunt for parasites. This was the name given to small creatures that came to human dwellings in search of warmth and food. The main object of such hunting was the ubiquitous rats and mice, which were abundant in barns, haystacks, and in the straw bedding on the floor of the huts themselves. They were caught with simple but effective traps, which every man made of wood and stone. Caught rodents were skinned, gutted, strung on thin twigs, and roasted over hearth coals. It sounds repulsive to us, but for hungry people it was a readily available source of animal protein. Another important target was small birds: sparrows, tits, thrushes, buntings. In winter, they gathered in large flocks and lost their caution in search of food, staying close to the villages. Children were the main bird watchers. They would set simple horsehair snares on the paths where the birds were looking for grain, or set basket traps, propped up with a stick and tied with string. A few precious grains were poured under the basket as bait. A dozen captured birds, plucked and thrown whole into the common broth, could greatly improve its flavor, richness, and nutrition. Squirrels, which did not hibernate and were active all winter, were also hunted. Snares were set on them in trees or hunted with the help of specially trained dogs, if there were any. Squirrel meat was considered quite edible, and the small but warm pelt was used to insulate mittens or hats. In the most desperate times, even hedgehogs found sleeping in piles of leaves. They were baked in clay to easily remove the needles. And frogs pulled from under the ice in ice-free streams could be eaten. This desperate hunting was an important supplement to the meager winter ration. It required not strength, but cunning, patience, and thorough knowledge of the habits of small animals. It provided not only protein, but also fats, which were so essential for heat production. This picture is very different from the romantic image of the Middle Ages, but it is much closer to the harsh reality of peasant survival. One of the main and most insidious dangers of the long English winter was not only colds or frostbite, but also scurvy, a terrible disease caused by the complete depletion of vitamin C in the body. The peasants' winter diet of grain, flour, dried beans, root vegetables, and salted meat was practically devoid of fresh fruits and vegetables. By the end of the winter in February and March, the body's vitamin C stores had dropped to zero. The symptoms were terrifying. Gums would swell and bleed so much that teeth would literally fall out. Old, long-healed wounds would reopen. Ulcers would appear on the body. The person would experience terrible weakness, apathy, and eventually death from internal hemorrhage or infection. But the peasants had their own secret weapon against this disease, which grew right under their noses, even under deep snow. These weapons were evergreen coniferous trees, pine and spruce. Peasants intuitively, or on the basis of centuries of experience, passed on by word of mouth, discovered that a decoction of pine or spruce needles had powerful healing properties. Women who were responsible for the health of the family collected young, bright green pine branches as they had the most power. They were finely chopped or crushed in a mortar, poured into hot water, and simmered for a long time by the hearth without bringing to a strong boil so as not to destroy the healing properties. The resulting drink was bitter, strongly smelling of resin, but surprisingly fragrant. Today, we know that pine needles are a real natural concentrate of vitamin C. Its content is several times higher than in lemons or oranges. Regular use of such pine needle tea completely covered the body's minimum requirement for ascorbic acid and effectively prevented the development of scurvy. This drink also had antiseptic, anti-inflammatory, and expectorant properties due to its essential oils, making it an indispensable remedy for treating winter coughs and colds. In addition to pine needles, other plants available in winter were used as a source of vitamins. For example, bright red rose hips, which remained hanging on bare thorny bushes all winter and only became sweeter and softer after the first frost. They were collected, dried, and brewed as tea. In some regions, dried berries of mountain ash or calamus were used. This knowledge of the vitamin pharmacy of the winter forest was as important as knowing how to hunt or store grain. It allowed them to maintain health and efficiency during the most difficult months. Perhaps the most important and the most unexpected way of survival in winter was not technology or cunning, but a special social organization. With the onset of severe cold and snowfalls, when movement between villages became impossible, the community went into a mode of social hibernation, turning into a single self-contained organism working to conserve energy and heat. Life didn't stop, it just shrank and moved inward. Often, several families would gather for long evenings or even a few days in one, the most spacious and warmest hut. This was done not only for socializing, but also for purely pragmatic reasons. Instead of burning 3 or 4 hearths, only one was used, saving precious fuel. The heat generated by the bodies of 20 or 30 people in one room alone raised the temperature considerably. It was a collective heating strategy. In such a common hut, there was a quiet, measured life. The men sat by the fire and repaired tools, mended plows, axe handles, and wove new harnesses. The women would set up their spinning wheels in the brightest corner and spin wool together, making the winter months the main season of yarn production for future clothing. The constant, lulling hum of the spinning wheels was the sonic backdrop of the medieval winter. It was a time of knowledge transmission. Old men, no longer capable of hard work, were the main keepers of traditions. They told children old legends, fairy tales, legends about saints and heroes. They taught young people the wisdom of survival, how to predict the weather from the behavior of animals, what herbs to gather, how to sharpen a knife. Oral tradition flourished during those long, dark hours of collective idleness. This social hibernation was also the most important psychological mechanism. It prevented people from falling into despondency and despair from the cold, darkness, and monotony. Working together, laughing, singing, gossiping, all this created a sense of unity and support. People felt that they were not alone in their struggle. The community became a big family, caring for widows and orphans, sharing the last piece of bread with those who had run out before. This dense social fabric was stronger than any wall and warmer than any fire. It made it possible to survive the winter not as a group of loners, but as a single, united organism. Looking into the world of medieval winter, we see not a story of suffering, but a tale of incredible ingenuity. This is a story about people who found food in poisonous acorns, medicine in cobwebs, and safety in weak beer instead of water. Their deep knowledge of nature turned moss into shoe insulation, and the smoke from the hearth into a preservative for the house itself. The story of their survival is not a hymn to suffering, but to human reason and the indomitable will to live. Their strength was not in sophisticated technology, but in deep harmony with nature and the ability to use each of its gifts. This is the main lesson of their harsh but dignified lives. True resilience is born from understanding the world, not from trying to remake it. If you were interested in this journey into the past, please like and subscribe to our channel to learn even more amazing stories about the brilliant ideas of our ancestors.